The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the red dirt road leading out of Tombstone, its rays creating shimmering waves of heat that danced like ghosts across the desert landscape. It was 1882, and the frontier town buzzed with the rough energy of miners, gamblers, and men seeking fortune or trouble, often both. Sarah Mitchell's bare feet pounded against the scorching earth, each step sending bolts of pain through her already wounded soles. Blood mixed with dust, creating dark stains on the ground behind her, but she didn't dare stop. The purple bruises on her arms had started to yellow at the edges, and the tear in her worn cotton dress exposed more skin to the unforgiving sun. "Please," she whispered to herself, the same word she'd been repeating for the past hour. "Please, just a little further." Behind her, somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the faint sounds of Tombstone, the clanking of spurs, the rough laughter from saloons, and worst of all, the voice of Madame Coulter screaming orders to find her. Sarah had worked in the Red Garter saloon for 2 years, trapped by debts she never truly owed and threats she knew were real. Last night, when that drunken cattle baron had gotten too rough and Madame Coulter had just laughed it off, something inside Sarah had finally snapped. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of sagebrush and jagged rocks under the cloudless sky. Her lips were already cracked, her tongue swollen with thirst. She'd grabbed nothing in her escape except the determination to never go back, no matter what the cost. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's steps became more labored. The adrenaline that had carried her from the brothel was fading, replaced by the harsh reality of her situation. She had no water, no shoes, no idea where she was going. The mountains in the distance wavered like a mirage, offering the false promise of shelter that seemed to move further away with each step. A rattlesnake's warning buzz froze her blood. Sarah stood perfectly still, her heart hammering as the creature slithered across her path, its diamond-patterned skin catching the light. Only when it disappeared into a cluster of prickly pear cactus did she dare to breathe again. "I won't go back," she said aloud, her voice hoarse and barely a whisper. "I won't." But even as she spoke the words, her body began to betray her resolve. The desert heat was overwhelming, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. Her legs felt like they were made of sand, shifting and unstable beneath her. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was another mirage, a figure sitting motionless on horseback about 100 yards away, perfectly still against the backdrop of red stone formations. But as her vision cleared, she realized he was real. A Native American man, his long black hair tied back, watching her with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. Fear and hope warred in her chest. She'd heard the stories about Apache raids, about the fierce warriors who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. But she'd also heard other stories about their honor, their protection of those who showed respect. The man on horseback made no move toward her, but he didn't retreat either. He simply watched, as if waiting for her to make the first decision. Sarah took another step forward, then another. Her vision blurred, and the world tilted sideways. She tried to call out, to say something, anything, but her voice caught in her throat. The last thing she saw before consciousness left her was the Apache warrior dismounting his horse and walking toward her with quick, purposeful strides. She collapsed into the red dirt, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, dehydration, and the weight of everything she'd endured. But for the first time in years, as darkness claimed her, Sarah Mitchell felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: the possibility of hope. The first sensation Sarah became aware of was coolness, blessed, wonderful coolness against her burning skin. Water trickled between her cracked lips, and she swallowed instinctively, her body desperate for the life-giving liquid. Gentle fingers supported the back of her head, lifting it just enough to help her drink without choking. When her eyes fluttered open, she found herself staring up at a face unlike any she'd ever seen this close. The Apache warrior who had found her had strong, angular features, weathered by years under the desert sun. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth of understanding that made her chest tighten. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheek, a reminder of some long-ago battle or hardship. "Easy," he said in accented English, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. "You drink too fast, you sick." Sarah tried to sit up, but her body protested with a wave of dizziness. She was lying in the shade of a large boulder, a blanket spread beneath her. Her feet had been cleaned and wrapped in strips of soft leather, and someone, this man, had tended to the cuts on her arms with what looked like desert plant salve. "Where?" she started, then coughed, her throat still raw. "Safe place," the warrior replied, offering her the water gourd again. "You very sick. Desert almost take you." As her mind cleared, Sarah began to take in more details. The man wore traditional Apache clothing, a breechcloth, high moccasins, and a cotton shirt that had seen many washings. His horse, a sturdy paint mare, stood nearby, its reins ground-tied in the way of riders who trusted their mounts completely. This wasn't a war party or a raid. This was a lone traveler who had chosen to help her. "Why?" Sarah asked, the single word carrying the weight of her confusion and gratitude. The Apache man studied her face for a long moment before answering. "In my language, I am called Nalnish. It means one who works with his hands, who builds. You understand?" Sarah nodded slightly, not sure where he was leading. "My grandmother, she teach me that life is sacred thing, all life. When I see broken wing on bird, I fix. When I see lost calf, I return to mother. When I see woman dying in desert." He gestured to her with hands that were scarred from years of hard work, but moved with surprising gentleness. "I help. But Sarah struggled with how to explain what she was, what she'd been forced to become. I work in a... People would say, I'm not worth helping." Nalnish's expression hardened, but not at her. At something else, something in the distance that only he could see. "White man town, full of people who think they know worth of others. My people, we know different. Spirit inside person, that is what matters. Your spirit, it still fights. I see this when you run." The simple acceptance in his words hit Sarah harder than any kindness she'd received in years. Tears she'd been holding back since her escape finally came, rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto the blanket. "I don't even know your name," Nalnish said gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Mitchell." He nodded formally, as if she'd given him something precious. "Sarah, good name, strong name." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the wind through the rocks and the occasional stamp of the horse's hooves. Sarah found herself studying this man who had saved her life, trying to understand why he would risk helping a white woman in territory where tensions between settlers and Apache ran high. "Why are you alone out here?" she finally asked. Nalnish's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My band, they moved to reservation 2 winters ago. Government men say we must farm, must live like white people, must send children to schools that teach them to forget who they are." He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. "I choose different path. I stay free, even if it means stay alone." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. "Very lonely, but free and lonely better than captured and... what is word, surrounded by people who not understand you." Sarah understood that feeling more than he could know. She'd been surrounded by people in the brothel, but she'd never felt more alone in her life. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Nalnish stood and walked to his horse. Sarah watched him unpack supplies with efficient movements, dried meat, some kind of root vegetable, a small cooking pot. "You stay here tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "Tomorrow we see how strong you are." "We?" Sarah asked, surprised by the word. Nalnish paused in his preparations and looked directly at her. "You cannot go back to White Man Town. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Desert is dangerous place for woman alone, but..." He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. If you want to learn, I teach you how to find water, how to read signs, how to survive free." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge across an impossible canyon. Sarah stared at this stranger, who was offering her something she'd never dared to dream of, not just rescue, but a chance at a completely different life. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Nalnish smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and it transformed his entire face. "Because sometimes broken things can be fixed. Sometimes lost things can find new path. And sometimes—" He returned to his unpacking, but his voice carried clearly across the small space between them. "Sometimes two people who walk alone can walk together and be less alone." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years settling in her chest. It wasn't quite peace. She was still too hurt and frightened for that. But it was the beginning of healing, the first tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end the way it had begun. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's collapse in the desert, and the woman who now knelt beside a hidden spring bore little resemblance to the broken creature Nalnish had found. Her hair, no longer matted and tangled, was braided back in the practical style he'd taught her. Her skin had bronzed under the sun, and the soft hands that had once known only the cruel touch of strangers were now calloused from gathering wood and working with desert plants. "Feel here," Nalnish said, guiding Sarah's fingers to a spot on the sandy ground. "Earth is different. More wet feeling. Spring is close." Sarah pressed her palm to the earth, concentrating. At first, she felt nothing unusual. But then, there it was. A subtle coolness, a barely perceptible difference in the texture of the soil. "I feel it," she whispered, wonder in her voice. Nalnish nodded approvingly. "Good, your hand's learning to listen." They had been traveling slowly through the Apache homeland, staying away from well-traveled routes and the areas where cavalry patrols might venture. Nalnish had been teaching her everything: how to read the sky for weather changes, which plants could heal and which could kill, how to move silently across different types of terrain. But more than that, he'd been teaching her how to live without fear. Sarah had been terrified the first few nights, starting awake at every small sound, convinced that either cavalry soldiers or men from the brothel would find them. But Nalnish's calm presence and evident competence had gradually soothed her nerves. He seemed to know every rock, every animal path, every hiding place in this vast landscape. "Tonight we reach special place," Nalnish said, as they prepared to move on from the spring. "Place where my grandmother lived as young woman. We stay there few days, and I teach you more things." As they walked, Sarah, now wearing proper moccasins that Nalnish had crafted for her from deer hide, she found herself studying her unexpected companion. In the weeks they'd spent together, she'd learned fragments of his story. He was 28, the same age as her. His father had been killed in a skirmish with Mexican troops when Nalnish was 15. His wife and infant son had died of the white man's diseases 3 years ago, just before the forced relocation to the reservation. "That's why you understand," Sarah had said when he'd told her about his wife. "About losing everything." "Yes," he'd replied simply, "but also why I know life can continue after great pain, must continue." Now, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah reflected on how much she'd changed. The constant fear that had lived in her chest for 2 years was slowly fading, replaced by something she was almost afraid to name: contentment. Not happiness. That seemed too fragile a thing to claim yet, but a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged. The special place Nalnish had mentioned turned out to be a hidden canyon, accessible only through a narrow crack in the rock face. Inside, a small stream bubbled down from the heights, creating a series of natural pools surrounded by cottonwood trees and wild grapevines. Ancient pictographs decorated the protected walls, handprints, animal figures, and symbols whose meanings had been passed down through generations. "My grandmother's people, They come here for ceremonies, Nalnish explained as he helped Sarah through the narrow entrance. Sacred place, safe place, safe. And that evening, as they sat beside their small fire, Sarah worked on a basket Nalnish was teaching her to weave while he repaired a tear in his shirt. The domestic simplicity of it struck her as almost magical after the harsh chaos of her previous life. Nalnish, she said carefully, I need to tell you something. He looked up from his sewing, giving her his full attention. In the brothel, men would pay Madame Coulter to... Sarah struggled with the words, heat flooding her cheeks. I need you to know that I'm not, that I can't, that I might never be able to. Sarah. Nalnish's voice was gentle but firm. You think I do not know what kind of place you come from? She stared at him, surprised. You think I help you, because I want what those men wanted. He set down his sewing and looked directly at her. I help you because you are a person in pain, because you deserve kindness, because... He hesitated as if weighing whether to continue. Because when I look at you, I see someone who fights to stay alive, who has strength even when she thinks she has none. That is rare thing. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. But if your people knew, my people know that spirits can be wounded and then healed. They know that what someone is forced to do is not who they are inside. He reached across the fire and gently touched her hand. The first deliberate contact between them since that first day when he'd helped her drink. Your past is like scar on skin. It part of you, but it not all of you. That night, Sarah lay on her blanket under a canopy of stars, brighter than any she'd ever seen, listening to the gentle sounds of the stream and Nalnish's steady breathing across the fire. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to truly sleep, deep and dreamless. She woke before dawn to find Nalnish already up, sitting cross-legged beside the dying fire with his eyes closed. She watched him quietly, noticing the peace in his face, the way his breathing seemed to match the rhythm of the canyon wind. You pray? She asked softly when he opened his eyes. I give thanks, he said, for water, for food, for... He looked at her meaningfully. For companionship. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. I should give thanks too, shouldn't I? Thanks come from heart, not from should, Nalnish replied. But if your heart has thanks, yes, good to speak them. Indeed, as the sun rose over the canyon walls, painting the ancient pictographs in golden light, Sarah found herself offering her first genuine prayer in years. Not the desperate pleas for rescue she'd whispered in the brothel, but quiet words of gratitude for the unexpected gift of a new beginning. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Sarah and Nalnish made their way down from the high country. 5 months had passed since their first meeting in the desert, and Sarah had been transformed from a frightened refugee into someone who could read the sky, track animals, and move through the wilderness with confidence. But more than her skills had changed. Her entire sense of herself had been rebuilt from the ground up. Storm coming, Nalnish said, studying the clouds gathering over the distant peaks. We need shelter soon. Sarah nodded, automatically scanning the landscape for the kind of protected spots he'd taught her to recognize. She spotted a promising overhang of rock about half a mile ahead. There, she asked, pointing. Good eyes, he approved, and the small praise warmed her more than she cared to admit. As they hurried toward shelter, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her companion. Over the months, their relationship had deepened into something neither of them had expected. There were moments when he laughed at something she said, when their hands accidentally touched while working together, when she caught him watching her with an expression of quiet wonder that made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. But she held back, uncertain. Not because of their different backgrounds or the prejudices of the outside world, but because she wasn't sure she could trust her own feelings. How could she know if what she felt was real love or just gratitude, twisted by dependence? They reached the overhang just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened up, sending sheets of water cascading down the rock face in front of their shelter. They were dry and safe, but trapped together in an intimate space no bigger than a large room. "Good timing," Sarah said, settling onto her blanket. Nalnish nodded, but she noticed he seemed restless, agitated in a way that was unusual for him. He kept starting to speak, then stopping himself, his hands moving in small, unconscious gestures. Finally, Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. "What's wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "Yesterday, when we were at the trading post, the Mexican trader, he asked me if you are my wife." Sarah's breath caught. They had indeed stopped at a remote trading post run by an old Mexican man who asked few questions and dealt fairly with anyone who had goods to trade. The man had been kind to both of them, but she hadn't paid much attention to his exact words. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no," Nalnish said simply. "But Sarah..." He turned to face her fully. "I wanted to tell him yes." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Sarah felt her heart begin to pound, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. "I wanted you to tell him yes too," she whispered. Nalnish's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't dared to hope for that response. "You are sure? You understand what this would mean?" Sarah thought about it seriously. "It would mean we could never go back to the white world. It would mean living always on the edges, always careful. It would mean..." She paused, gathering courage. "It would mean choosing to build something new, instead of trying to fix something broken." "And you want this?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah reached across the small space between them and took his hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, rough and calloused but infinitely gentle. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "Not because you saved me, not because I owe you anything, but because you showed me who I could be. Because you make me want to be brave." Nalnish lifted their joined hands and pressed her knuckles gently to his lips. "In my heart, you have been my wife for many weeks now. I was only waiting for your heart to be ready." "My heart is ready," Sarah said, and knew it was true. The rain continued to fall, but inside their small shelter, everything had changed. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening, making plans for their future. They would continue to live free, moving seasonally through the vast territories where the old ways still held sway. They would find others like them, Apache people who had refused the reservation, Mexican families who lived independently, white settlers who had chosen isolation over society's conventions. "We will have children?" Nalnish asked, as the storm finally began to clear. "If we're blessed with them," Sarah replied. "Children who know both worlds but belong fully to neither. Children who are free." "They will be strong," Nalnish said with conviction. "Children of parents who chose love over fear, who chose freedom over safety. Such children are always strong." As the stars emerged in the clearing sky, they performed their own marriage ceremony there, in the shelter of the rocks. Nalnish spoke words in Apache, calling on the spirits of his ancestors to witness their union. Sarah spoke from her heart, promising to walk beside him through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had no rings, no official papers, no witnesses except the desert wind and the ancient stones. But when they lay down together that night as husband and wife, Sarah felt more married than any legal ceremony could have made her. "No regrets?" Nalnish asked softly in the darkness. Sarah thought of the life she'd left behind, the brothel, the degradation, the hopelessness. Then she thought of the life stretching ahead, uncertain but freely chosen, difficult but filled with love. "No regrets," she said firmly, "only gratitude." Years later, when their children would ask how their parents met, Sarah would tell them the truth. That sometimes, when a person is brave enough to run toward an unknown future instead of accepting an unbearable present, the desert itself will provide exactly what they need. And that love, Real love isn't about being saved. It's about two people choosing to save each other every single day. In the morning, they would continue their journey. Two souls who had found their home, not in any particular place, but in the space between heartbeats, where one person's breath mingles with another's, where two paths become one road, and where the horizon stretches endless and free ahead of them.